Good afternoon. We're about to start our session, so if you would take your seats. Thank you. Ladies, excuse me, we're getting ready to start. Oh God, what did I do? Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Deborah Morton. I'm the Deputy Director for Parks and Recreation in the City of Richmond, Virginia. You are in the session called Tools for Trust from the Lens of a Social Crisis. So if you've worked a long time in municipal government, you've probably encountered some sort of social crisis in your cities or your counties. Managers and administrators must not only deal with the issue at hand, but make sure we can communicate and build trust with the community in a transparent way. How do we as managers and administrators help our citizens and communities become more resilient so that we foster healthy, inclusive community interaction and relationships? So we have three panelists today who will talk about how to deal with crisis while building community trust. So first is Christian Clegg. He is Deputy City Manager of Stockton, California. During his 8 years in Stockton, he had the opportunity to see a municipality rebuilt from the ground up, establishing a new Office of Violence Prevention and managing collective strategies with community partners. Christian will talk about Stockton Ceasefire Leadership Council, which deals with crime and violence in Stockton and police and community relations. So Becky Monroe is Director of the Divided Communities Project, as well as Distinguished Practitioner in Residence, Ohio State Moritz College of Law, Columbus, Ohio. Ms. Monroe has a depth of experience supporting communities in conflict. Some of this experience includes Senior Counselor and Director of Policy and Planning for the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and she previously served as Director of Stop the Hate Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Ms. Monroe will discuss the Divided Community Project with examples of community resiliency initiatives. And last but not least is Elon Sims. He is Director of Community Philanthropy at the Crane Group, Columbus, Ohio. His responsibility at Crane is oversight of the philanthropic programs that include strategic community engagement, volunteerism, and charitable contributions, to name a few. As former Director of Community Relations in the Mayor's Office in Columbus, Ohio, he served as volunteer coordinator and facilitated with the Divided Community Project, a program focused on working with public officials, community leaders, and residents to develop plans to ensure trust and open communication. He will discuss the Midland Simulation, a partnership between the City of Columbus, Ohio, and the Divided Community Project. So let's welcome to the podium Christian Clegg.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I can tell a story today about a unique group of young men that we call our Leadership Council. The police community relations work in Stockton, as well as our ceasefire and violence prevention work, are probably two separate presentations, and I'll reference those briefly to provide context, but really it's a story about giving voice to individuals that trust institutions the least, but probably need us the most, and have had very little voice historically. And I think you'll find that this panel were individuals that come from fairly different backgrounds and some different case studies, but really all about creating that trust in challenging environments. So for context, Stockton, it's in California. It's a fairly large city, but by California standards, we're only the 13th largest, and you don't hear of us quite as often as some of the others. A very diverse community, both socioeconomically as well as ethnically. And the story of Stockton is one of renaissance and rebirth. There's been a very interesting turnaround in Stockton following a fiscal crisis in 2011, 2012, and at the same time we're experiencing a very serious violent crime spike. But also we've been facing generational issues around safety and the underlying factors that lead often to vulnerability for being an at-risk individual and getting into a life of crime and violence. And I think it's probably fair to say that historically our city officials and law enforcement professionals have not been viewed as the community as highly representative of our community diversity. So one of the things that we've been working really hard at in Stockton is collective impact work. It's exciting having an opportunity to reinvent a broken community, and we've tried to work with many different stakeholders across the gamut on those, as I mentioned, those vulnerability factors like education, housing, employment, health, and safety. And some of the initiatives that might sound familiar at the national level, My Brother's Keeper and Promise Zone, these are the types of initiatives that we've been doing as collective impact, but tailoring them specifically to our community. And there's been a lot of community engagement and trust building within that work, and I'm just going to focus on one element of that. I have to give credit really quickly to our police department, and I'm not here representing them, but we have a very progressive chief who's doing incredible work. They're winning national awards and being asked to come and train in other departments around the country because of the national initiative on community and justice and community trust and justice. And they're a leader in procedural justice and implicit bias training. They've been doing incredible work on reconciliation with those communities that have felt a distance to our leadership and to our police department. And the chief has formed an advisory board where it draws from individuals from around the community to meet on a monthly basis and give feedback to the chief directly about the issues that they're facing, as well as other strategic initiatives around neighborhood and community policing, as well as transparency, and working differently with the police officers to focus on strategic issues. So let me tell you a little bit about Office of Violence Prevention. We are typically in the top 5 in the state. We've been in the top 10 in the nation around gun violence, and we have one of the highest rates of gang-related gun violence in the state and historically in the nation, although we were happy to fall out of the top 10 in the nation because of the work that we're doing. So many have probably heard of Operation Ceasefire. It's about identifying those individuals at highest risk of gun violence and doing direct intervention with them. But every community has a slightly different take on ceasefire. And for Stockton, we have what we call our triple bottom line. We definitely want to lower citywide violence rates. We want to lower homicides and shootings. But for us, it's also about changing the individual outcomes of the individuals that are in those lifestyles and making their lives different, making a change in their lives. It's not all about enforcement. It's largely about the community coming together in support of them. And then the third bottom line is that we feel like there's a way to do this, that you can actually increase trust and relationships between institutions and law enforcement through this work based on how you do it. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. We did a lot of in-depth analysis in Stockton to try and find out who is at the heart of gun violence. And you find that less than 0.1% of the population does 70 to 80% of the gun violence in our community. You think of a city of 300,000 people, that's a population of 250 individuals. Like, that's a number we can actually get at. There's something, we can make an impact in the lives of those individuals. They also happen to be individuals who have come into that lifestyle largely because of generational issues, socioeconomic challenges, and so there's mistrust in institutions that they may feel have failed them, and it's been challenging to create trusting relationships with them. But it's largely about respectful communication to them initially, saying that we care about you and we know that you're in this lifestyle, but we want you to be safe. We want you to be alive, and we want you to, have good outcomes in your life, and we're here to help you do that. If you don't choose that path, there will be consequences, but there's all these resources and support to help you follow that path. So we have outreach workers and case managers that work very closely with these individuals. We actually keep our caseloads really low because it's a small number of individuals. If you see other social workers or probation departments, their caseloads can be into the tens and hundreds. We maintain our caseload no more than 10 or 12 individuals, and we have 8 outreach workers that work with them because they need that kind of intensive focus. we made a determination in this work that we wanted to hear from the people that were coming into our program so that we could make it better and understand their real needs. Like, I didn't live that life. Many of our caseworkers did, but the dynamics on the streets changed very quickly, and we wanted to hear from individuals. So we started by having focus groups with clients to talk about the things that they heard in these communications and the things that they were experiencing as they were making a change in their lives. And these focus groups led to some amazing information. Things that, we're smart people and we think we know what's going on, but to hear directly from individuals things that we had never really contemplated, and I'll share some of those examples, it was really mind-blowing for us. And so we said, we have a real opportunity here to take these individuals who were 1 or 2 years ago shooting at one another, who've developed trusting relationships with us, largely because of those caseworkers. They're the real heroes in this story. And they are now becoming community advocates and wanting to be involved and have voice. And so we created what we call our Leadership Council. We actually did this through some grant funding from the state. And we took 13 clients who had had a shift in mentality and were showing really good results. And we sat down and said, this is actually your venue. We empowered them and said, what do you want to do? What do you want to talk about? What are some of your issues? And just one small example, they said, we want to talk to the chief of police. We want him to come down here and we want to give him a piece of our mind. And they didn't think we would do it. So we asked the chief, come on down, chief. Let's have a listening session. Let's do a reconciliation. And they were totally blown away when the chief and the deputy chief showed up. But the things that they were able to share were really remarkable. So this is Deputy Chief actually with our Leadership Council members. They went through a year-long curriculum that we developed through the grant program. We had a graduation ceremony and Deputy Chief was there to congratulate each of them. So because we were listening closely to this Leadership Council, we met monthly with them for an entire year, listened to their voice. The way that we were talking to individuals in these direct communications, they shared some important information about how that message was being perceived in a way that we didn't intend it to be, and so we tweaked our scripts. Also, the chief of police listened closely, and he changed the training that they give to our officers based on the feedback from this advisory council. Individuals who had been arrested many times. Most of our clients have 8 touches with the criminal justice system, typically 5 felonies, and 80% of them have been shot at, and about 50% of them have been shot. So these are individuals very familiar with the criminal justice system, but from a different lens, but wanting to put them at the center. We're able to change how we give our procedural justice and implicit bias training to our police officers, and Leadership Council members now go to each training and give some perspective from their lens to the officers. In addition, we changed some of the protocols in the police department about how we do stops and arrests to make sure that there's respectful communication and people feel respected in those instances, even though at times they're necessary. Also, we didn't design this so that they would become advocates, but out of this process, our Leadership Council members are saying we want to be part of the message of creating peace in our community. And then we have a community engagement coalition. It's a number of partners that are working on broader violence prevention issues, and they've wanted to be participants in that as well. These are interesting examples, but again, really I think at the core of it is giving voice to these individuals that didn't have voice before, and we've discovered really amazing things from them that we never would have had they not been part of the equation. With that, if those who are looking online or want to follow up later, we have a really cool video that tells the story of one of our Leadership Council members and his success story that's available offline. And with that, I'll shift over. Really quickly, I'm sorry, I forgot about this slide. These are just some pictures of our caseworkers and their clients. It's about first helping them to have trust, helping them to see that they can see their world in a different way. And then we're about getting them jobs, getting them educated. And this individual here in orange, he teases his caseworker because he got into the heavy equipment operators union and he's making probably double what our outreach worker's making. With that, I'll turn time over to save time for our other panel members and questions.
Good afternoon. I have to say it's really exciting for me to be here because I've been in civil rights as an attorney and both with the Justice Department as well as with nonprofits for over 18 years now. And what I have seen certainly recently and really over the course of my career is the power of people in this room to make a real difference. The part of what I'm going to talk about today are tools that we have tried to create really because of the input we've received from city managers, from people who are working in mayor's offices and county commissioners' offices. But what I've seen is that the difference that can be made when you have somebody who's in the position that you're in, who's willing to sort of bring in community in a way that leads not only to listening, but to action in the way that Christian was describing is really powerful. So just to give you a little bit of background, so I am from, I apologize to everyone who's not from Ohio. I am from The Ohio State University, which I just did a training in Knoxville, Tennessee for the Knoxville Police Department, which is right next to the University of Tennessee. And as you might imagine, they were not amused by The Ohio State University. But part of it, we created this project, and it's almost like it's a nonprofit, but it's based at Ohio State. And part of the reason we're there is that we do have a very strong, the country's #1 alternative dispute resolution program. And so what we're trying to do is bring mediation techniques, conflict resolution techniques, so if you were in the last session, and they talked a little bit about that, to address different issues. But again, what makes us, we think, a little bit different is that we are bringing insights that we've received from law enforcement leaders, from government leaders, from community leaders who have all worked to develop resilient communities, often in the face of very volatile conflict. So when we develop reports, so I've got some reports here you're welcome to take, they're available online. They are based not just on theories, but they are based on the actual experiences of people who are in your position, in police chiefs, civil rights advocates, who kind of came together to say, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, this is what we wish we had done differently. One of the things we're going to talk about, and that my colleague Elon's going to speak about, is the simulation that we've done, or a tabletop exercise. Part of that is about responding to civil unrest. And as a civil rights attorney, I will tell you, one of the first questions I get is, why are you trying to prevent civil unrest? That is the voice of the people. And I will be very clear, we are not talking about preventing it. We are talking about how you kind of keep people safe in the context of civil unrest, and then pivot to understanding how to address some of the underlying issues that may be there and may have been there for a long time. We have a steering committee that includes a police chief, that includes retired mayors, people who've worked in different mayor's offices, as well as dispute resolution practitioners. One of the people who I work with the most is Andrew Thomas. So Andrew Thomas works now for the city of Sanford. He works for with Mr. Bonaparte, so if many of you may know him, I think he's very active in ICMA. He's a city manager there. One of the things that we try to do, and what we've learned from both from Mr. Bonaparte's leadership there, but also from how Sanford responded. Many of you may remember the name Sanford because that's where Trayvon Martin was killed. And you may remember just the devastation across the country, but also in that community. And one of the things that Andrew did, so Andrew Thomas is someone who could have retired in Sanford, but he felt like he needed to sort of respond and serve his community. So once he started working in the community in Sanford, not only did they work with the Community Relations Service, and we're going to talk about sort of that as a resource, to try and keep people safe during protests, but they quickly turned to understanding what are other underlying issues, what are issues around longstanding forms of discrimination that we need to address as a city. And they did it in a way that they held themselves accountable, they engaged people, and to this day, they still have meetings with community leaders from across the country talking about sort of what they've done. And within Sanford, they're still holding themselves accountable to the community in that way. At the Divided Community Project, we offer many resources to people like you, free of charge. One of the things we do is a bridge initiative, which is offering sort of rapid consultation, so sometimes it helps to have an outside mediator come into a situation. One example I can describe, because the mayor has decided to make it public, we're working right now in Bloomington, Indiana, with the mayor there. There he asked for, part of why mayors sometimes bring us in is that they recognize that there is a lot of commitment in the community to make a community better, but that when there's a point of division, it can help to have someone come in from the outside. I don't know, in Bloomington, they've had an incident where someone at the farmer's market who was a vendor there for a long time, they learned was a white supremacist or was connected to a white supremacist organization. And there were protesters and counter-protesters, the potential for violence suddenly at the farmer's market, and then also a lot of people talking about sort of their tension there in the community. And so we've actually, through the Bridge Initiative, we are working, and we have mediators we send out with a former mayor of Rochester, New York, who also spent 2 decades as the head of the Urban League in Rochester, is going out to talk to community members to think about listening again, and particularly to people who are very critical. What can they be doing differently, and how do they address some of those underlying issues? We also have the American Community Spirit Initiative. That's something that some communities have asked us to sort of create to help communities. The idea is that when there's points of division, it can be helpful sometimes to identify what are some of the aspirations that unite us. This is not an opportunity for people to, to pretend like there aren't real divisions. Rather, it is a very sort of step-by-step process. If you want to have those conversations in your community, we found when people identify, again, what they have in common, and often it's those aspirations for what they want for their family, what they want for their community, you can kind of use that as a basis to strengthen the community going forward. The community resiliency initiatives, I will not spend a lot of time on those, in part because one example is in Columbus, but we've worked with communities across the country, and you can actually, again, the materials that I brought highlight some of those examples, where the idea was sort of how do you develop broad-based capacity in a community to respond to crisis or division in advance of that. And so really very kind of practical tools about bringing communities together. And then finally, the Tabletop Simulation, which is a place where it's an exercise where we kind of introduce a very realistic and actually pulled from the headlines example of what can happen in a community when, and in the context of the simulation we're going to talk about, there's a hypothetical executive order coming from the federal government around immigration policies, and there's a lot of division in that community. Then you have different injects that we bring, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of why we found that to be an effective way to bring people together. So I mentioned the Bridge Initiative, and I gave you the example that we are currently engaged in. We're working now in many different communities across the country. And again, when people call us in, one of the first things we recognize is that the answers are there in the community, they are there in the city, and that our only role is to bring a process that has helped in other communities to help them sort of identify both how do you listen effectively to people across divides, and then how do you move from that to action. And I mentioned we have a former mayor, we have a police chief, we have other folks who have had experience in doing this work, and so when they come into a community, they may be in a place to sort of say what happened with their own experience, but they're also all trained mediators, so they understand that the real way we move forward with this is going to be by sort of harnessing the wisdom that's already in that community and just helping to sort of move forward and then get out of the way. So these are some of the resiliency initiatives I mentioned before. So you can see we're all across the country. We also worked with an academy, and this is sort of a 2.5-day intensive training for community groups where people came together to talk about, these are some of the issues that are confronting us. And again, we brought in people from Orlando to talk about after the Pulse shooting, what did they do? We talked to Andrew led a lot of sessions from the perspective in Sanford. And obviously, as you can see from the participants, there was a lot of learning between cities. So when you have Charlottesville talking about what they've been doing the last couple of years, Memphis talking about some of the issues they've confronted historically and how they're addressing those today, it's an effective way to sort of share learning. Again, not just from sort of instructors, but really to build this cohort of groups that we've been successful in doing. And I think, one example would be we were highlighting the success of one of the cities and bringing in some of their biggest critics in planning something. So I think one of the things you talked about, which is so critical, is it's really hard to bring in the people who are yelling at you the loudest, but bringing them in a way where they were able to sort of constructively say, well, if you don't like it this way, can we talk about how we should build it for the next year? And they talked about what worked and what didn't work, what they wish they had done differently. But again, sort of more practical resources. Here's some additional resources available on our website. I'll just highlight a couple. Planning advance of civil unrest, so it offers points that people wish they would have considered before. Key considerations, it's like a checklist. So again, we try to make this as practical and straightforward as possible. Talking about dealing with social media, I know everyone is dealing with this, and I think many of you would have insights here, but talking about strategies that have worked for communities, as well as the case studies and the American Community Spirit Initiative that I mentioned is intended to just give you sort of resources if you want to take them and run. Finally, the tabletop simulation, and I'm going to turn it over to Elon to provide more background about how it worked in Columbus. But this scenario includes volatile conflict, civil unrest, and it encourages people to respond in real time. One of the things that's sort of fun is that you get assigned a role, you get confidential instructions, and we have found different cities, depending where we are, choose to do different things in terms of people playing in role or out of role. So I was just talking to Norton Bonaparte from Sanford. When we went to Sanford, he chose to play an advocate. He's a city manager, and I will say he did so with great gusto because I think he had heard a lot from community members, and he was incredibly powerful, such that I think it was somebody from the fire department was playing the mayor, really had to step back and think about how to respond. But the goal here is sort of twofold. One is, let's think about how would you respond, how did you prepare for unrest in your community? Do you have a plan, and if not, build a foundation to develop that. But it's also, it helps build relationships inside the community. So inside a city, for example, if people, I can't tell you how many times I would hear from one department and say, they don't even have any idea what I do. And so the idea is when you bring people together on something that they have sort of a common purpose, they realize someone's already doing that work, or that's extraordinary, that would help me do my work. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is certainly some communities bring in community leaders so they can see it and they can understand that people are grappling with these issues. So as I mentioned, we've conducted this in Columbus, Dallas, San Leandro, Sanford, Florida. We've worked with city leaders from counties outside of Houston. I'll be doing it in Norman and Oklahoma City shortly. And we've also done it actually with ICMA leaders in the past. So just to give you a sense of what people say after they do it, they say the debrief itself helps people quickly assess what worked, what didn't work. Why did you think that would work and then it didn't end up sort of playing well? What would work in your department? You leave with an ability to plan something more effective. So, one of the things I mentioned here is we've had a mayor who participated in the session say, look, I plan for natural disasters. I plan for issues around when we have someone who's shooting. We've never talked about having a plan for civil unrest, and they made a commitment there when there were community leaders in the room that they're going to go do that. The other thing, we had a police chief say this is how it really plays out. So I will tell you, the person who's playing the mayor, who maybe doesn't usually play the mayor or the police chief, gets frustrated because we will have a session and then all of a sudden we'll say, and now 2 students have attacked each other at the local school district. How are you going to respond to that? And how are you going to, and now there's somebody who's reporting that one of your city council's members have gone rogue and is speaking about something that they're not supposed to speak about. So give very realistic sort of examples. And before I turn to we're going to have a video from the mayor of Columbus who's just going to talk about how the simulation worked in his city. And I will again say we offer these services free of charge. We're funded by grant money. We're doing this because we think it is important for the country, and we think that working with leaders like you is actually a way that we can start to sort of build some of the bridges that'll help kind of strengthen the community going forward. So I'm going to see here.
The City of Columbus participated in the Divided Community Project's Midland simulation, which encouraged my staff to consider how to respond to a series of escalating issues dividing the fictional Midland community. The simulation provided a realistic gauge of the mounting tensions that occur between city officials, residents, and community advocates and civic leaders during periods of community division and civil unrest. Following the 2-hour simulation, the Divided Community Project led my staff in a conversation to unpack the lessons of the simulation. Using anonymous polling software, my staff candidly assessed community division and tension in the Columbus community. The project used our responses as a platform to elicit ideas, to enhance the city's community engagement efforts, to leverage the work of community partners, and to begin planning in advance of civil unrest and social crisis. The Midland simulation was an opportunity for my staff to identify how they will support the community during a social crisis and encourage participants to think creatively outside of our traditional silos. Ben Franklin tells us if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Midland has helped Columbus plan. The Divided Community Project is willing to do the same in your community.
Thank you, Mayor, for that intro. Just a joke there. Again, my name is Elon Sims, and former Director of Community Affairs in the Mayor's Office in Columbus. And so for us, participating in the simulation was one that began, I would say, about 9 or so months in advance of us actually participating in December of 2017 of the simulation. Those conversations truly began with folks from the Divided Community Project reaching out to our office to share more about what they were learning in the communities, but also how we as Columbus could get engaged. And for our mayor, having this program right in our community, right in our back door, was for us a way for us to be able to step up in a way that we hadn't seen other cities do. And so our mayor had a commitment to doing this and bringing our city leaders together in order to go through this exercise in a way that was going to help to inform our processes moving forward. One of the things that Becky just mentioned is that one of the things that we know in our community is that we do really well in terms of planning for those disaster type events. She mentioned OSU earlier. Lots of folks, 100,000 plus in a stadium at a game, and so when you see the operation that goes into place and getting folks in and out of there, we're really good at stuff like that. But when it comes to actually planning for community or civil unrest, we recognize that we need to do a better job in that space as well. And so in the few moments that I have with you all, I'll just share a little bit more about the process that we went through in order to build that partnership with the Divided Community Project and some of the lessons learned from the simulation as well. Just a little bit of background on Columbus, 14th largest city in the country, about just shy of 900,000 people. Also very diverse racially and economically. Our city is growing tremendously. Current data shows that we're going to have an addition of 1.1 million people within the next 15 to 20 years. And so with that growth, of course, can come challenges, but also great opportunities as well. And so but when we think about some of those challenges, our thought was, what can we be doing on the front side of those in order to try to address some of those concerns? When you have different thoughts, ideas, perspectives, beliefs that are growing in communities, what can you be doing to engage various constituency groups in order to address some of those concerns? And the simulation, from our perspective, was a way to go about doing that. And one of the things that we also thought about before we engaged in the simulation was, just like many cities around the country, many of us can be like one situation away from a national known issue. You think of Charlottesville and other areas in the community and across the country, and so we thought that we need to do a better job in order of preparing our staff and our community leaders on how we would go about approaching some of the things that may happen in our community as well. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the process started very early on, even prior to me even joining the mayor's office. And so we happened to be in a meeting one day with the mayor, and he mentions, he goes, "Hey, whatever happened with that conversation with that group from Ohio State doing this simulation type thing?" And you saw the look of confusion around the room, and my boss looks at me and says, "Mayor, Elon's gonna follow up on that." And so, like any good employee, I did my part to follow up with the folks at Divided Community Project and learn more about the simulation for myself, and reported that back to our staff. And I would just say, we were so glad that we did, because it allowed us to be able to engage in this process to help to build this program. And so how we structured the simulation. And so originally the simulation was designed by an OSU law student. And so once I received the simulation, there's a set of facilitator instructions that you receive. And so I had a chance to read through all of those instructions, and then we decided that, we wanted to make it more realistic for our office and for our city, and add some elements that would allow us to be able to utilize some tools that what we wanted to practice, I guess, in the simulation. And so we added additional roles. Our mayor had actually earlier on in the year had signed an executive order that related to immigration that we added as part of the simulation as well. And so it allowed us to be able to really take the simulation in its current format, but added some elements that fit better for us as well. We also took the time to, as we made those adjustments, work closely with the folks at the Divided Community Project to assess those changes. And we also had an internal working group team in the mayor's office that worked to build out the process for it all as well. Earlier, Becky had mentioned that there's a number of roles in this tabletop exercise, and there's probably about, I would say, 20 or so different roles. I think we added probably 10 when we did it. And so really for us, we wanted to be ensure that there was a number of folks who could participate in the process across the mayor's office and for city staff. And so we just try to find a way to engage as many people as possible in the process as well. And so when we're thinking about how we are going to utilize some of those roles in the simulation process, we actually had our staff serve as in their current capacities. And so many cities have done that different ways, but we decided to have folks serve in their actual roles. So our mayor served as mayor in the simulation, and he sat through the entire 3-hour exercise, which was surprising to many of us, but it showed his level of commitment to ensuring that we all had this foundation level understanding of how to respond to civil unrest in our community. And so, and for us, again, I mentioned we did it. There's opportunities for you to be able to serve in a capacity where you have just your entire team serving all the roles, or you can have community members participate as well. We decided to have just all of our mayor staff, city employees serve as all the roles, and we did that for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to make sure that everyone got a chance to participate, but two, and quite frankly, we were still a little bit unsure of what it was going to feel like and be. And so we wanted to kind of get that understanding before we invited some of the community stakeholders into the conversation as well. But I would definitely say thereafter there was a commitment to do the simulation again with some external stakeholders as part of the process too. In terms of some of the additional observations that we had as part of the experience, we had the time to be able to assess the experience in general and begin to think about how we can build additional protocols, additional mutual agreements with our suburban partners, as well as try to find ways to engage our community in a different way as part of this experience. And so we wanted to make sure that we also thought about the next time we did this, we had the right people at the table there with us. We also thought it would be good to educate the public on that we were doing this work as well. One of the things that when you're working with the community from our perspective was that we were doing this work internally at the mayor's office, and when people say, okay, what's the city doing in responding to the potential for civil unrest, we know we needed to share more of that as part of our process as well. We also we have folks share a little bit more about how it was when we're dealing with difficult situations in our community. I would say probably similar to other communities as well. Many things get kind of worked out via email, over the phone, and it's rare to have everyone kind of sitting at the table at the same time and actually working on those things together. And so for us, there was a benefit to actually seeing folks sit across the table from you, having a greater understanding of, okay, this is the role that we're actually, you actually do, and now I have a greater understanding, and here's how you would make that kind of decision. And so it helped folks to learn that as well. And then lastly, I would just say that for us, it identified ways for us to be able to learn some earlier warning signs and find ways to better engage our community stakeholders and to be ready to deal with these kind of situations in the future. And so after the simulation was done, these were some additional thoughts that we had that led to the development of our our community civil unrest plan. And so one of the things that we know, and it's not unique to Columbus, I'm sure it's very similar to other communities as well, is that we thought that after the simulation, we said, it's good for us to be able to understand some of our community's challenges. So listening to the community, understanding how they define some of those challenges. There are many underlying concerns that I think we may not always consistently think about when we're dealing with some of these community types of issues, but we wanted to make sure that we did our part to understand those community issues as defined by the community. Additionally, want to be sure that we are also gathering community stakeholders, and so making sure that we're identifying all the individuals, who may not always agree with us, and for them to be at the table as well. Becky kind of referred to that earlier, and so there have been a number of situations, even outside of this simulation for the city of Columbus, where we've actually invited folks, to sit down with us. We'd much rather have you join us in these efforts and help us to be able to create understanding and to build understanding across our community as well. And so the city is continuing to work to do that as well. Also, working to formulate a coalition, and so committing to that shared leadership model that allows people to be able to add their voice. And so one of the tools that I had come across when I worked in the mayor's office was this, it was a community engagement continuum, and it was adapted by the Spectrum for Public Participation, which was a document that was actually done by the International Association of Public Participation. And this continuum really looked at how to best build trust, communication, build partnership, and engagement with the community. And the continuum goes from a first phase of outreach, where you are actually informing the community and just sharing information. The second phase looks at, once we share that information with you, now we're getting feedback. And one of the things that we recognize in Columbus, and some of you may also recognize as well, is that we're really good in that space of, we'll give you some information, we'll get a little bit back from you, we're done, the community has been engaged. But we know that it goes beyond that. The next steps talks about creating partnerships and having folks at the table with you. And that final phase looks at how do you ensure that when you have a community level decision, that we have empowered the community to be able to make the final decision. One of the things that we know is that while we use this as a guide, we know that as city officials, there are sometimes we have to make decisions that on behalf of residents. That's what we are elected to do. But there are many opportunities for us to be able to allow the community to make those decisions on behalf of themselves as well. And so for us, the culmination of these kind of really first 3 steps led us to, and utilizing this continuum, allows us to think differently about the work of developing a specific civil unrest plan for our community. And luckily for us, our community was already engaged in this work. And so we had come alongside the efforts of the Columbus Community Trust, which I've served as a volunteer with while I was in the mayor's office and since leaving the mayor's office. And so really the role of the trust is to convene community stakeholders, to build trust, amongst community leaders, to identify and design processes to deal with those types of issues in communities, to prepare those communities to respond to those issues and develop those shared plans as well. Our goal in the Columbus Community Trust is there's really 2 unique deliverables: to ensure the community is prepared to deal with these kind of situations, and to enhance the community's resiliency. Our community trust in Columbus has 5 unique work groups. Those include the Readiness Work Group, Future Concerns, Community Resilience, Youth and Education, and Communications. And so I think one of the documents on the table on the back side of it shares a little bit more about the work of each of those work groups. In Columbus, the Readiness Work Group is the group that's actually charged with developing the civil unrest plan. And so since late 2007, early 2018, this group has been meeting monthly in order to develop those plans with groups all across Columbus. So you think elected officials, public officials, residents, faith leaders, community advocates, all sitting at the table in order to contribute to what the community plan looks like to address civil unrest. And so ultimately, our goal in Columbus is to really ensure that folks have the opportunity to express their free, right of speech in a safe and productive way, and that we can continue to provide the avenues for them to do that as part of this work. So thank you for the opportunity for sharing.
Thank you, panelists. Can we give our panelists another round of applause? Thank you. So we are open for questions. Please come up to the microphone because we do have people online that's listening to the presentation. And so if you have any questions for our panelists today, come on up. Don't be shy. Anyone? Okay.
So my question primarily has to do with, I don't want to say the definition of civil unrest, but kind of about the different ways it manifests, and if you have different toolkits or ways that you think are better approaches to dealing with it. Because I can kind of think about how there might be an underlying issue around civil unrest or kind of communities not feeling heard versus kind of an incident response or like an event that it triggers community unrest more kind of as an incidental action. But I was curious about kind of that approach.
I think it's such an important question. I think partly because, I mentioned that there's some people who kind of challenge us on saying, why are you talking about civil unrest? Are you going to prevent it? Is it community unrest? How do you really think about that? So I would say we think about it in both ways, and I'll give you an example. So I mentioned in Sanford, Florida, after Trayvon Martin was killed. And there was such pain and fear in the community, and that was certainly around the horrific killing of Trayvon Martin. What we quickly learned, and I think what Andrew Thomas and the city manager there and the city officials there learned, was that people were protesting about that, but when they went out and started listening, there were concerns about unequal resources going to certain parts of the community. There were concerns about the fact that there had been an African-American community called Goldsboro that had been absorbed by the city of Sanford a generation before almost. And that pain was still very deep. The idea that street names had been they tried to erase history was this feeling that there were street names after African-American leaders and they had changed. And so part of what they did in the city was both think about how they responded to the immediate crisis of thinking about how do you keep people safe and how do you protect people's rights to protest, but then also turning to address some of those longer term issues. So they developed a 9-point plan to address those longer term issues to bring the community back together. One other thing I will mention is that I think as city leaders, you have people who are coming to protest on many different sides. So another issue that we have seen is that people may be coming to protest on behalf of civil rights. You may also have Klan marches in your city. So those are all different forms of civil unrest that are obviously about an issue that may happen in that moment. Maybe there's a protest planned, a march planned. But then when those marches happen, then you have to start thinking about how do you pivot to address the underlying issues. When a Klan march happens, it is terrifying, it is devastating, it is also bringing up issues that have probably been there for a long time. And it's an opportunity as a leader to both reckon with those issues in the short term, but then turn to address them in the long term. So I wish I'm giving you like a lawyerly answer, which is, it depends. But I think that it's a really important question, and I think inevitably what may seem like it's something that just happened, it is often getting at deeper issues, and it is this opportunity for you to address them too.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, you had a question?
I was a little curious, when you talk about communities, is that everyone in the community, or is that like a segment of the community? And what about areas where it's so diverse that you've got like multiple sections of the community?
I could talk about two. You should start, and then I could,
Yeah, a good question. And I think we use it because it's convenient, because it is broad and it inclusive. And the good news, it's inclusive, but that doesn't always offer clarity. There are many communities within a community, and I think when you're trying to get at the deepest issues, you should think about what are all the communities and do a little bit of work thinking that through and analyzing that. But one of the lessons learned too is you can ask that question of the community that you think you've defined for them, but how do they define themselves? And are there subgroups, and are there other groups that they feel are associated and related? And actually raise that question as an opportunity to, work with them and whoever they feel connected to.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I think you're right. We use it very loosely, but I think, just to echo what you were saying, one of the dangers is going into a community and saying, oh, we have one representative of this community, we're done. Communities are not monolithic. It is incredibly dangerous, and you could be stereotyped. There's a whole host of issues there. So one of the things that we often see, for example, if we're going into a community with the Bridge Initiative, or if we're just talking to leaders, another thing we often do is just connect leaders with other leaders. So people may call us and say, I don't know what to do here. And we'll say, well, this person tried this, see what you think. Is reaching the person who's not the traditional community leader. How do you get the neighbor who everybody knows, she knows what's happening in that community. She's not the head of an organization. She's not the vice president of the junior. She's someone who knows. And so and you just have to keep asking who's not at the table. And it is not, so I think when we say defining a community is never ending, which is frustrating, but on the other hand, you have this incredible opportunity to get these insights that you didn't know were there. And that's one of the things I think from the learnings that we try to put together in the materials. People will talk about just how extraordinary it was that they hadn't heard that before, and part of it was they just hadn't been at the table.
Yeah. I would definitely, thanks for those comments. I would definitely say for us, we, as being on the community affairs team in the mayor's office, our role was to kind of go out and have those conversations and keep asking who's not at the table, who's not here, and actually work to build those relationships in order to define whether that's a new community or others that we just haven't had any contact with. And so there are those of us who worked in the mayor's office who our role was to engage particular communities consistently in order to work to try to identify what are some of those issues that you all are dealing with, and how should the city be coming alongside you into resolving some of those challenges, but also how we can work to address them, as from our perspective as well. And so, again, it's a broad term, but we really work to try to work across all of our communities in Columbus to ensure that they had a voice and connection to the mayor's office in order to share their perspectives and concerns.
Great question. Any other questions? Well, our panelists will be around for a few minutes. Feel free to come up and talk to them. Becky has information on the tables for you to take with you. Thank you for coming out today to our session. Oh, and please take the evaluation. It's on the app, the ICMA conference app. Please fill out the evaluation. We really appreciate your time.